Martin Delgado, newly elected as the sheriff of Redwood County, arrived in the tranquil suburb of Bloomfield Grove brimming with optimism. After a spirited election campaign in a bustling city center, he yearned for a simpler life where neighbors greeted each other over white picket fences. So he chose to settle in a modest home on a tree-lined street, hoping to forge genuine ties with the community he now served. At first glance, Bloomfield Grove appeared serene. Rows of tidy lawns and trimmed hedges suggested a cohesive, well-maintained neighborhood. Yet, from the moment Martin moved in, he felt an undercurrent of watchfulness. Only a handful of residents offered polite waves or half-smiles. Most kept a polite distance, as though awaiting instructions on how to treat their new neighbor, especially one with the badge and authority of a sheriff. Then there was Denise Caldwell, president of the Greenstone Council, a local homeowners organization known for strict aesthetic rules. She wasted no time making an impression. On the morning after Martin's arrival, Denise marched up his driveway, pointed out a minor weed in his flower bed, and mentioned how the Greenstone Council expected immaculate upkeep. The conversation struck Martin as odd. Her tone carried a strange intensity, as if testing his boundaries. He assured her he respected community standards and would do his part. Denise eyed him warily, thanked him, then left without a shred of neighborly warmth. Over the next few days, Martin's encounters with Denise piled up. She'd appear unannounced, scrutinizing his driveway or questioning his choice of mailbox decor. Meanwhile, the rest of Bloomfield Grove stayed mostly quiet. A few neighbors offered a welcome to the area, but their greetings felt perfunctory, overshadowed by Denise's looming presence. Martin noted the subtle tension. As soon as Denise materialized, others backed away. "What do you think? Where are you watching from?" Let us know in the comments, like, share, and don't forget to subscribe for more shocking stories like this. Eager for privacy and safety, Martin planned routine security measures for his new home. Although Redwood County was generally peaceful, his experience as a law enforcement officer taught him the value of proper locks and reliable entry systems. He saw no harm in calling a locksmith to ensure everything was in order. But when he casually mentioned his plan to a neighbor, word must have traveled. Denise reappeared later that afternoon, inquiring with feigned politeness why he needed to replace locks. She hinted that any exterior alteration might require approval from the Greenstone Council. Martin, taken aback, replied that switching out locks was hardly a major renovation. In those first few days, Martin sensed a storm brewing behind Denise Caldwell's rigid exterior. Yet, he hoped it was just small-town fussiness, something he could navigate with patience. Even as a newly elected sheriff, he wasn't looking to ruffle feathers. He wanted to be a good neighbor, helpful, approachable, respectful. Little did he know, his simple wish for security would soon clash with Denise's fierce hold on Bloomfield Grove's rules, propelling him into a conflict far more troubling than unkempt lawns or mismatched mailboxes. Determined to secure his new home, Martin Delgado scheduled a meeting with Manny, a dependable locksmith he had worked with previously. Manny arrived one sunny afternoon, his van full of specialized tools, ready to change Martin's locks. The plan was straightforward: remove outdated hardware, install sturdy deadbolts, and maybe upgrade a few latches. Martin considered it a routine procedure, an easy step toward peace of mind. But as Manny unloaded his gear, something about the atmosphere in Bloomfield Grove felt tense. A few neighbors peeked from behind curtains, and a hushed ripple of curiosity spread along the street. Martin brushed it off as mild nosiness, typical for a close-knit suburb unaccustomed to the comings and goings of service vans. He pointed Manny toward the front door and went inside to fetch some items. Before the actual lock installation began, though, a familiar voice rang out, Denise Caldwell. She marched onto Martin's driveway wearing a grave expression. "I understand there's an unapproved change taking place," she stated, glancing disapprovingly at Manny's toolbox. "As Greenstone Council president, I must remind you that all exterior modifications need prior submission." Martin was taken aback. "I'm just changing my locks," he said. "It's not an aesthetic alteration, just a security measure." Denise offered a tight-lipped smile. Nonetheless, the council's guidelines can be very specific. We prefer standard finishes for doorknobs to maintain neighborhood uniformity. Also, any visible changes to door hardware might clash with Bloomfield Grove's uniform look. Manny, sensing the tension, tried to lighten the mood. "Ma'am, I have plenty of hardware styles that blend right in. It won't look out of place." But Denise's expression remained stern. She repeated that any changes required formal review, handing Martin a pamphlet outlining Greenstone Council protocols. Feeling a mixture of disbelief and annoyance, Martin politely explained that, as a homeowner and newly appointed sheriff, he had the right to ensure his property was secure. He offered to fill out any necessary paperwork but insisted that rekeying a door hardly merited a bureaucratic process. Denise frowned at his mention of being sheriff, her gaze flickering with something akin to defiance. She turned on her heel and left, muttering about reporting the matter to the council board. Unfazed for the moment, Martin told Manny to proceed. Manny swapped out the locks and tested them, ensuring the new system worked smoothly. The entire process took under an hour. Martin thanked him, paid the invoice, and watched Manny drive off. He hoped that would be the end of the drama, or at least that any fuss from Denise would blow over. However, within an hour, Martin heard approaching sirens. A squad car halted in front of his home, lights flashing. 2 officers stepped out, confusion apparent in their demeanor as they scanned the quiet street. Martin stepped outside to meet them, identifying himself as Redwood County's newly elected sheriff. The officers exchanged looks of recognition. They'd heard about Martin's arrival but had never met him. They explained they'd received a 911 call reporting a possible break-in at Martin's address. "A neighbor insisted someone was forcing their way into your locks," one officer said. "We came to investigate." Martin realized instantly that Denise must have phoned the emergency line, painting Manny as a burglar. Exasperated, he assured the officers that Manny was, in fact, a licensed locksmith carrying out a perfectly legal job at Martin's request. "He left just a short while ago," Martin added, gesturing at the brand new locks. There was nothing suspicious. The officers apologized for the inconvenience, confirming that the 911 call was clearly a false alarm. They left, but not before Martin quietly expressed concern about the misuse of emergency services. He couldn't help feeling that Denise was testing his patience, and possibly his authority. Moments later, Martin spotted Denise hovering near her driveway, arms folded. He walked over, cautioning her not to treat the police like a personal complaint line. "Calling 911 for non-emergencies is serious," he said. "Please exercise better judgment." Denise's cheeks flushed, and she offered no apology. Instead, she retorted that if he hadn't bypassed the Greenstone Council's rules, she wouldn't have panicked. Martin's frustration grew. "This is my home. I have the right to protect it." She glared, and for a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then Denise turned sharply and went inside, slamming her door. In the days that followed, Martin's new locks worked flawlessly, yet the tension simmered. Denise kept a watchful eye from across the street, occasionally snapping photos of Martin's front porch or rummaging around her yard whenever he stepped out. Some neighbors gave him pitying glances, clearly aware of the brewing conflict but hesitant to intervene. Despite the unease, Martin told himself he'd done nothing wrong. He wanted to be both a good neighbor and a diligent homeowner. However, it was becoming clear that Denise Caldwell played by her own set of rules, Greenstone Council or otherwise, and she wasn't afraid to escalate matters if something didn't fit her vision of Bloomfield Grove. For Martin, the fuse had been lit. He just didn't realize how quickly it would burn, leading him to uncover startling truths about the woman behind the council badge, and the lengths she would go to maintain her grip on the neighborhood she considered her domain. The morning after the 911 debacle, Martin Delgado felt compelled to learn more about the woman causing him such grief, Denise Caldwell, head of the Greenstone Council. He headed to the Redwood County Sheriff's Office, occupying a small but functional corner of the building as he settled into his new role. In between briefings and phone calls, Martin carved out time to look up public records that might clarify why Denise wielded such power in Bloomfield Grove. Scrolling through county archives, Martin stumbled upon a trail of documents showing Denise had served as Greenstone Council president for nearly a decade. During that span, she championed stringent neighborhood codes, some seemingly innocuous, like approved paint colors, others oddly restrictive, limiting the styles of front door knockers or the shapes of mailboxes. Many residents quietly adhered, not wanting trouble. But Martin unearthed more alarming information. A reference to a civil complaint filed 2 years earlier by a family who accused the Greenstone Council of selective enforcement, particularly targeting homeowners of color. That family, the Harrisons, alleged that while white neighbors received leniency for minor infractions, they were slapped with fines for trivial issues like grass length or fence paint. The Harrisons eventually moved away, citing a hostile environment. The lawsuit ended in a private settlement. Intrigued, Martin dug deeper, discovering a series of online forum posts, under a username suspiciously similar to Denise's, containing racially charged remarks. Nothing blatantly hateful, but coded language referencing preserving the neighborhood's legacy and keeping certain elements out. Coupled with references to the lawsuit, it painted a disturbing picture. Martin's mind churned. Was Denise employing subtle discrimination to maintain her version of Bloomfield Grove? Could her animosity toward him, a newly elected sheriff known for advocating equality, stem from prejudice? Eager for more clarity, Martin confided in a colleague, Deputy Rita Morales, who had patrolled Bloomfield Grove sporadically over the past year. Rita recounted minor complaints from Denise, like calling about suspicious dog walkers who turned out to be regular residents, and about her repeated attempts to correct a neighboring family's holiday decor. Although no major incidents had been reported, Rita described Denise as controlling, borderline intrusive, with an uncanny ability to make people's lives miserable through official-sounding but questionable council rules. A few days later, Martin returned to Bloomfield Grove from work, only to spot a folded paper tucked under his doormat. Inside was a crudely drawn map showing property boundaries. He recognized his plot, with an exaggerated line indicating a portion of his fence apparently encroaching on land that, according to the diagram, belonged to Denise. A note scrawled in neat handwriting read, "This is not within acceptable limits. Correct it or face council penalties." Frowning, Martin compared the map to his official property deed. The claim seemed baseless. The fence had stood there for years, presumably on the rightful boundary. Why would Denise present this dispute now? Martin suspected she was searching for any angle to harass him. The next morning, Martin brought the note and map to the county surveyor's office, requesting verification. The surveyor quickly confirmed the fence sat within Martin's rightful property lines. The staffer shook his head, remarking that he'd heard of the Greenstone Council stirring up petty boundary fights before, often scaring people into compliance. Martin realized this was likely another tactic. If she couldn't scold him over doorknobs or locks, she'd move on to property lines. Undeterred, Martin decided to gather more evidence. He scanned social media for local groups, discovering that some neighbors complained about Denise behind closed doors. One post read, "Watch out, if you cross Ms. Caldwell, she'll bury you in council codes." Another wrote, "Greenstone Council is a tool for discrimination, but no one's had the courage to fight it openly." Martin found references to intimidation, arbitrary fines, and consistent targeting of those who didn't fit Denise's preferred demographic. Armed with these insights, Martin devised a plan. If Denise escalated further, he would confront her openly and rely on his position as sheriff to uphold the law. He realized that, ironically, a woman claiming to represent community standards might be flouting legal boundaries at every turn. He didn't have to wait long. The very next week, Martin woke up to the roar of machinery near his fence line. Investigating, he discovered a small crew of workers preparing to tear down a section of the fence. Their foreman explained they'd been hired by the neighbor next door, who claimed part of the fence was on her property. Martin halted them immediately, showing his sheriff's badge and pointing out the official documents verifying his boundary. The crew, unsure, backed off, saying they only had Denise's instructions. Suddenly, Denise herself appeared, arms crossed, accusing Martin of ignoring repeated warnings. She insisted the fence was illegally placed and that the Greenstone Council had approved its removal. Martin stayed calm, repeating that official records proved otherwise, and that forcibly removing his fence without a court order was illegal. Furious, Denise tried to shame him in front of the workers, claiming he was abusing power to get special treatment. But Martin reminded her that as sheriff, he was simply enforcing actual property law. If she believed the boundary line was incorrect, she'd need to obtain the relevant legal documentation or a judge's ruling, not sabotage his fence. The confrontation drew onlookers from nearby houses, some filming on their phones. The tension peaked when Denise demanded the workers proceed anyway, prompting Martin to firmly instruct them to stand down or face criminal trespass. In that charged moment, a hush fell over the onlookers. Denise's fury was palpable. Her plan to use the encroachment claim had failed spectacularly under the weight of real legal authority. She glared at Martin, a silent threat blazing in her eyes. Then, without another word, she stormed off. The construction crew began packing up, muttering apologies. Martin exchanged glances with a few neighbors, who looked both relieved and emboldened. It was becoming clear that, for too long, Denise had weaponized council regulations to bully residents. Now that she'd encountered a person who knew the law as well as she manipulated it, the tide was turning. Martin suspected it was only a matter of time before her behavior landed her in deeper trouble. That suspicion proved right. Within hours, Martin received a phone call from the Redwood County Dispatch. A complaint had been filed against him, presumably by Denise, claiming harassment and abuse of power. Rolling his eyes, Martin asked the dispatcher to log the complaint. He was more than ready to provide evidence of Denise's repeated intimidation, false boundary claims, and unauthorized attempts to damage his property. Though he had no desire for further conflict, Martin knew the next step was inevitable. Denise Caldwell's consistent overreach and potential prejudice were bound to come under official scrutiny. He just hoped that the entire neighborhood, especially those who had silently suffered, might finally see justice done. And if the legal system followed the facts, it wouldn't be Martin in jeopardy, but Denise herself, for harassing a rightful homeowner and orchestrating what was shaping up to be a racially tinged campaign against certain residents of Bloomfield Grove. The morning after the dramatic fence standoff, Martin Delgado made his way to the Redwood County Courthouse to discuss the latest developments with the district attorney's office. The fence incident had highlighted Denise Caldwell's willingness to flout the law, and Martin wanted to ensure he handled the situation with complete transparency. Serving as the new sheriff, he had no interest in appearing biased, even though he was personally targeted. He laid out the entire sequence for the DA's team: the suspicious 911 call over changing locks, the property line dispute, the attempt to tear down part of his fence without legal authority. The attorneys listened intently, taking notes. One asked if Martin believed there was a deeper motive behind Denise's actions, perhaps prejudice. Martin hesitated, mentioning the prior civil suit against the Greenstone Council and the rumored discrimination complaints from minority homeowners. "I can't prove it's all racially motivated," he said, "but I suspect bigotry plays a role in her selective enforcement." Satisfied with the evidence, the DA assured Martin they would monitor the situation. If Denise made another illegal move, false reports, trespassing, or inciting property damage, there would be grounds for criminal charges. Though relieved to have official backing, Martin also sensed the matter was on the brink of explosion. Denise's pattern suggested she wouldn't simply retreat, she thrived on controlling her environment. That hunch proved spot on when, later that afternoon, a Redwood County detective phoned Martin with a bizarre piece of news. The detective had discovered a string of old forum posts from Denise that singled out Martin by name, referencing his position as sheriff and hinting he was dangerous to the neighborhood's traditional values. She'd also posted cryptic remarks about knowing who to call to handle undesirables. Some messages were more overtly racist, disparaging Redwood County's increasing diversity. Though the detective wasn't sure if these posts rose to the level of hate speech or direct threats, they bolstered the case that Denise's hostility extended beyond mere property disputes. Martin felt a surge of anger. This was no longer about petty council rules, it was turning into a hateful campaign, targeting him as an outsider who threatened her status quo. Determined not to let frustration cloud his judgment, Martin compiled these forum posts into a file, tagging them as additional evidence. He also reached out to neighbors known to have clashed with Denise before, discreetly asking if they'd be willing to share experiences. A few stepped forward with documented fines or notices that seemed absurdly trivial, while some from minority backgrounds confessed feeling singled out for minor violations that white residents avoided. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, depicting Denise as a gatekeeper who used the Greenstone Council's rules to discriminate and maintain power. Meanwhile, Denise was not idle. She convened a special session of the council's board. Martin wasn't invited, but rumors spread that the meeting's agenda revolved around guidelines restricting what the sheriff could do to his property. The notion sounded ludicrous, but in Bloomfield Grove, people had grown used to Denise's brazen strategies. A couple of nights later, the tension boiled over. Martin returned home from an evening shift to find a group of strangers milling around his driveway. Approaching carefully, he realized they were evidently hired by Denise, contractors or day laborers, stacking lumber and equipment near the fence. One man said they'd been ordered to fix the fence line. Martin demanded they leave, explaining no legal authorization existed to move or demolish anything on his property. A heated exchange followed until Martin threatened to arrest them for trespassing. They quickly packed up and left, clearly spooked by his badge. Still fuming, Martin noticed a black SUV parked down the street. The silhouette of a lone driver inside suggested someone was watching. He suspected it was Denise's associate or possibly Denise herself. Martin walked toward the SUV, but it sped away. This cloak-and-dagger approach worried him. Denise was escalating beyond official channels, potentially resorting to intimidation tactics. If so, she was dancing on the edge of criminal conspiracy. The next day, Martin filed a formal complaint with Redwood County's administration, citing repeated harassment attempts. In return, the County Code Enforcement Office opened an investigation into the Greenstone Council's potential misuse of authority. The wheels of bureaucracy churned, and soon the local press caught wind of a conflict between a brand new sheriff and a powerful homeowners group. Journalists began sniffing around for a juicy story of small-town drama layered with hints of bigotry. For Martin, the last thing he wanted was a media frenzy, but perhaps the spotlight could push Denise to either stand down or be held accountable. Sure enough, local TV crews arrived in Bloomfield Grove, capturing footage of the tree-lined streets and Martin's modest house. Some residents refused to comment, others timidly admitted they'd seen Denise single out families of different races for petty infractions. The resulting coverage painted Denise as an overbearing figure who might be abusing the council's rules for discriminatory ends. Still, the final straw was yet to come. Early one morning, Redwood County Dispatch notified Martin of a suspicious call from Denise claiming Martin himself was harassing and threatening her near his property. This time, two deputies who answered the call found no sign of Martin outside. He was at the station, finishing paperwork. The blatant falsehood was enough for the deputies to take statements from neighbors, one of whom provided smartphone footage showing Martin's car was gone the entire time. With these repeated false alarms, the DA's office concluded they had grounds for charges. They moved swiftly. A warrant for Denise's arrest was issued, citing harassment, false reporting, and incitement of illegal property damage, namely sending workers to tear down Martin's fence without lawful basis. When officers arrived at her door, she tried to protest, brandishing her Greenstone Council badge as if it held legal sway. The moment was surreal, with onlooking neighbors and local reporters filming as Denise, haughty in her council presidency, was handcuffed and led away. The media pounced on the arrest, turning it into a countywide spectacle. Phrases like HOA overreach and racial bias allegations splashed across headlines. The Redwood County Civil Rights Division launched its own probe into the council's pattern of enforcement. Several board members, previously silent, distanced themselves from Denise, claiming they never sanctioned her extremist actions. For Martin, relief mixed with sadness. He had no relish in seeing a neighbor arrested. But this fiasco had grown beyond trivial disputes. If Denise's brand of discrimination and intimidation was left unchecked, it could poison the entire community. As news vans lined Bloomfield Grove sidewalks, he hoped the legal process would bring clarity and, eventually, healing to the place he'd chosen as home. Standing by the fence that had sparked such chaos, Martin contemplated the irony. He'd simply wanted new locks and a quiet, welcoming neighborhood. Instead, he uncovered a festering wound, a local leader bent on controlling who belonged. Now, the law had stepped in, and the next chapter would involve a courtroom deciding how far accountability should stretch. In the aftermath of Denise Caldwell's arrest, Bloomfield Grove found itself under a microscope. As local news channels replayed footage of the Greenstone Council president in handcuffs, the media narrative shifted from a quirky HOA conflict to a potential civil rights case. Martin Delgado, Redwood County's newly installed sheriff, wrestled with mixed emotions, relief that a primary antagonist faced legal consequences, yet worry that the neighborhood's wounds might run deeper than one individual's bad behavior. Over the following days, Redwood County's Civil Rights Division launched an official investigation into the Greenstone Council. Several members resigned, claiming ignorance of Denise's extreme tactics. Others admitted to voting in her favor out of fear of retaliation. Whispers surfaced of a hidden playbook used by Denise to target undesirable residents through arbitrary code enforcement. Documents leaked anonymously hinted that Grace, a name Denise used in internal memos, was just a front for a broader plan to keep Bloomfield Grove homogeneous. For Martin, the revelations were both validating and disturbing. Meanwhile, Denise languished in county jail, awaiting her bail hearing. Her attorney scrambled to control the narrative, insisting that she was misunderstood, a champion of community standards, who'd been demonized by the press. Martin read these statements in the newspaper, shaking his head at their attempts to spin the story. He wondered if the public would buy it after seeing the repeated false police calls and the malicious attempts to demolish his fence. The county prosecutor, bolstered by the fresh wave of evidence, prepared a comprehensive case. Beyond harassment and false reporting, they considered charges related to civil rights violations, given her possible racist motives. Martin wasn't privy to every detail, but from what the DA's office shared, it looked grim for Denise. The trail of forum posts, the prior lawsuit from a black family, and multiple witness accounts indicated a systematic pattern of targeting people who didn't fit Denise's idea of neighborhood uniformity. During this tumult, Martin tried to preserve a sense of normalcy. He still performed his duties as sheriff, responding to traffic incidents, assisting with small investigations across Redwood County, and striving to improve community policing. Some residents, once wary of a new sheriff in their midst, began approaching him with confidence, no longer intimidated by Denise's overshadowing presence. They asked about property guidelines, wonder if the council would be disbanded or reformed. Martin calmly explained that any reorganization would happen after a thorough inquiry, urging them to speak up about past injustices so the Civil Rights Division could gather the full picture. One quiet morning, a knock sounded at Martin's door. He opened it to find Hannah Wright, a longtime Bloomfield Grove resident with kind eyes. She carried a small folder of documents. Tentatively, she recounted how she and her husband, who is Latino, had faced a barrage of petty fines from the council, excessive noise complaints, alleged yard violations. She believed it was racially motivated. "We stayed silent because we feared making it worse," Hannah confided. "But we see you standing firm, and we want to help." Martin felt a surge of gratitude. He invited Hannah to share her experiences with the civil rights investigators. She agreed, relieved to have an ally in law enforcement who wouldn't dismiss her concerns. Over the next week, more neighbors stepped forward, describing how Denise used intimidation to maintain a veneer of compliance. They recalled her brazen stares, her threats of legal action, and the hush that always followed her pronouncements. In parallel, local journalists dug up additional controversies surrounding the Greenstone Council, a cancelled Diwali festival at the community center, a suspicious refusal to rent a communal space to a Nigerian couple for a birthday party, consistent rejections of building permits for families rumored to be from diverse backgrounds. The pattern was undeniable. Martin realized he'd not only confronted an overzealous HOA leader but possibly dismantled a microcosm of systemic discrimination. While public sentiment swung heavily in Martin's favor, he stayed modest. "I simply enforce the law," he told a reporter. "Anyone is welcome in Redwood County as long as they respect one another's rights." Critics, though, painted him as orchestrating a witch hunt against a misunderstood community advocate. Martin brushed off these claims. The evidence was too strong, the harassment too blatant. Eventually, Denise was released on bail. Freed from jail, she wasted no time making defiant statements to the press, accusing Martin of smearing her reputation, calling the civil rights inquiry a witch hunt, and asserting she'd done nothing more than uphold Bloomfield Grove's proud traditions. But her attempts to rally support largely fell flat. The council, in disarray, distanced itself to avoid being tarred by her actions. The few loyalists who remained organized small protests outside Martin's home, brandishing signs about HOA freedom. The protests never grew large, and Redwood County deputies closely monitored them to prevent violence. The tension peaked when Denise decided to hold a press conference in front of her own property, flanked by her beleaguered attorney. She repeated claims of innocence, insisted the fence fiasco was a misunderstanding, and blamed the woke media for spinning a narrative of racism. But she faltered when a reporter confronted her with direct quotes from her online forum posts, including references to keeping the neighborhood pure. Denise stumbled in her response, eventually storming away from the podium. That fiasco only further cemented the public's perception that she'd been lying. Amid this swirl, Martin took solace in the everyday tasks of his job. Redwood County's routine calls, a lost dog here, a minor traffic violation there, grounded him. The public meltdown in Bloomfield Grove was just one dimension of his duties. However, he knew that the day was coming when the courts would decide Denise's fate. The district attorney had lined up witness after witness, each one verifying her pattern of harassment and prejudice-laced intimidation. Finally, a date was set for her trial. Preparations ramped up. Martin revisited his phone logs, camera footage, and written notes detailing each conflict. He compiled them into a neat binder for the DA. The Civil Rights Division also announced they'd file separate charges if the criminal case revealed conclusive evidence of racial bias. The stakes soared, and Bloomfield Grove braced for a spotlight-laden conclusion. In the calm before the legal storm, Martin often reflected on how innocently it had begun. Wanting to rekey his locks for safety, only to spark the wrath of a power-hungry HOA president. The scenario captured attention precisely because it illuminated bigger truths, the ease with which a seemingly benign group could evolve into a discriminatory apparatus under the wrong leadership. Now, Redwood County citizens awaited the verdict that might expose or confirm those truths. Martin, for his part, stayed resolute. He'd come to Redwood County to serve justice, and fate had handed him a case that tested both his convictions and his patience. Court proceedings against Denise Caldwell began with a swirl of media attention. Inside Redwood County's modest courtroom, reporters lined the back row, cameras banned but pencils and notepads ready. Although the trial was nominally about harassment, trespassing, and incitement, onlookers understood it touched on deeper questions of discrimination and abuse of power. Martin Delgado, wearing a neat suit instead of his sheriff's uniform, took his seat among the witnesses. He anticipated a long process. The defense would try to discredit him or frame him as an overzealous law enforcer. Meanwhile, the prosecution aimed to link Denise's string of hostile actions to an underlying racist agenda, given the swirl of evidence from neighbor testimonies, online forum posts, and a prior lawsuit settled by the Greenstone Council. On the first day, the prosecution outlined its key points. Denise orchestrated repeated harassment of Martin, including false 911 calls and employing workers to remove his fence. Evidence showed a pattern of intimidation toward minority residents, culminating in Martin's experience. Denise used her role in the Greenstone Council to target individuals she deemed unfit for her vision of Bloomfield Grove, crossing legal boundaries in the process. The defense, in turn, attempted to paint Denise as a dedicated community leader who might have been overzealous but acted in good faith to uphold neighborhood standards. They questioned whether Martin's role as sheriff gave him undue leverage or if he misread her strictness as prejudice. They also suggested that the racist label was overblown, tied to a handful of ambiguous forum posts. To Martin's relief, the prosecution came equipped with an arsenal of witness statements. Residents like Hannah Wright testified about the disproportionate enforcement from the Greenstone Council, often overshadowed by Denise's personal bias. A local father recounted how Denise once threatened to have his daughter's lemonade stand shut down for littering. Another neighbor described seeing workers approach Martin's fence under Denise's orders, ignoring his rightful ownership. Slowly, these anecdotes built a mosaic of petty tyranny that overshadowed the entire community. When Martin took the stand, he spoke calmly of the initial friction with Denise over his door locks, her use of 911 to allege a break-in, the dubious property line dispute, and her final attempt to forcibly remove his fence. His phone logs, security footage, and formal complaints backed up every detail. The defense tried to poke holes in his narrative, insinuating he was paranoid, but Martin's measured responses and thoroughly documented evidence proved tough to undermine. A pivotal moment came when the prosecution played a montage of Denise's now infamous forum posts on a projector, omitting slurs but highlighting phrases loaded with prejudice. The jury winced at lines about preserving the racial makeup of Bloomfield Grove and driving out troublemakers. Coupled with references to the settlement from a black family's lawsuit, the prosecution framed these statements as no coincidence but a consistent ideology. The defense attorney scrambled, insisting the posts were taken out of context, but the repeated pattern was undeniable. Outside the courthouse, the press corralled passers-by for sound bites. Some Bloomfield Grove residents praised Martin's courage, while a small group of diehards believed Denise was a scapegoat. The tension spilled onto local social media, dividing Redwood County. Yet, as the trial progressed, more voices emerged condemning the bigotry revealed in these proceedings. Even some Greenstone Council members acknowledged regret for not questioning Denise's methods sooner. Midway through the trial, a bombshell witness stepped forward, Sarah Jenkins, a former council board member who had resigned in protest. She recounted closed-door meetings where Denise allegedly singled out certain families, especially those she considered not like us. Sarah admitted she'd been complicit by staying silent, but hearing about Martin's ordeal finally spurred her to reveal the truth. She described how Denise manipulated architectural rules to bully residents, often tying their violations to personal biases. The defense attempted to discredit Sarah, painting her as a disgruntled ex-colleague with a vendetta. But her testimony was detailed and consistent, naming board members who witnessed Denise's rants, some of which took on a distinctly racist tone. By the time Sarah finished, a hush fell in the courtroom. Denise stared daggers at her, but the impact was done. A once powerful president was laid bare as an orchestrator of systematic hostility. Meanwhile, Martin experienced a personal wave of relief. Having his suspicion validated, that Denise's acts weren't random but part of a deeper prejudice, allowed him to see it wasn't just about him or his fence. This was a broader stand against intimidation disguised as community upkeep. As the trial neared closing arguments, Redwood County's Civil Rights Division announced they'd file separate charges if the evidence confirmed Denise targeted minority homeowners. Legally, this put more weight on the jury's shoulders. Could they convict her solely on the acts against Martin and the existing testimonies? Or would they see the bigger pattern of civil rights violations? The defense flailed, trying to keep the focus narrow, labeling the broader allegations character assassination. In the final days, the prosecution hammered home the timeline, from Martin's door lock fiasco to the fence demolition attempt, each step revealing Denise's disregard for actual law. They juxtaposed her official stance about neighborhood standards, with her documented calls to incite her people to handle so-called problems. The parallels were chilling, especially in a county that prided itself on welcoming new residents. On the last afternoon, both sides delivered closing statements. The defense cast Denise as a well-intentioned caretaker who might have gone too far but had no malicious prejudice. The prosecution countered that controlling each neighbor's mailbox color was one thing, deliberately harassing people of certain backgrounds was quite another. They urged the jury to separate neighborly rules from the toxic vendetta on display. The jury deliberated overnight, returning a verdict the following morning. Tension swirled in the packed courtroom. Denise sat rigid, refusing eye contact with Martin. The lead juror pronounced her guilty on charges of harassment, false reporting, and incitement of unlawful activity. Cheers erupted among some spectators, while a few of Denise's supporters stormed out, muttering about an unfair trial. The judge scheduled a subsequent hearing to address sentencing and indicated potential for further civil rights repercussions. Outside, Martin exhaled heavily, leaning against the courthouse steps. Reporters thrust microphones at him, demanding his reaction. He kept it brief, stating gratitude for the justice system and the hope that Bloomfield Grove could heal and uphold fairness. The cameras pivoted, capturing the swirl of emotions among residents. Some praised Redwood County for stamping out prejudice, others lamented the negative publicity. But Martin felt the real victor was the truth. In a county that had welcomed him as sheriff, some with open arms, others begrudgingly, this trial showcased the dangers of giving one person or group unchecked power. Even a quiet suburb, obsessed with tidy lawns and uniform exteriors, could harbor ugliness if left unexamined. Martin resolved to use his platform to encourage deeper unity, ensuring no future official manipulated rules to harm unsuspecting neighbors. Though sentencing lay ahead, and the possibility of additional civil rights charges loomed, Martin sensed this moment would stand as a turning point. Bloomfield Grove had glimpsed the festering prejudice beneath polished picket fences. Now, the community had a chance to rebuild trust on a foundation of genuine respect. Martin intended to be part of that renewal, merging the role of law enforcement with the compassion of a neighbor who believed in second chances, provided they were anchored in accountability and the sincere desire to move forward, free from hidden hate. After the guilty verdict rocked Bloomfield Grove, the neighborhood found itself in a period of tense introspection. Denise Caldwell remained in custody, awaiting sentencing, but her reach still lingered. Some residents, newly emboldened, spoke openly about the times she'd threatened them with petty fines or half-heartedly demanded compliance. Others, however, mourned the downfall of a woman they saw as the embodiment of community order. In Redwood County at large, the question on many minds was whether the trial's revelations would spark meaningful change or fade into a news cycle memory. Against this backdrop, Martin Delgado sought to balance his responsibilities as sheriff with the unexpected role of local figurehead. People recognized him from the coverage, seeing him as the catalyst for unmasking an unjust power structure. The Redwood County Civil Rights Division deepened its probe into the Greenstone Council, now suspecting deeper, institutionalized bias beyond Denise's personal actions. Meanwhile, Martin fielded phone calls from residents across Redwood County, some praising his stand, others requesting advice on dealing with unfair neighborhood rules. In Bloomfield Grove, the council's leadership was in disarray. Denise's top allies resigned in quick succession, unwilling to face scrutiny. A few moderate members attempted to rewrite the group's bylaws, removing clauses that authorized unannounced property inspections or singled out unsightly yard displays. They hoped to salvage the council's credibility before the county might disband it altogether. Martin, for his part, observed from a distance. He recognized that any internal reforms were best led by the residents themselves, not forced by him. Still, he wasn't entirely hands-off. Several neighbors approached Martin with requests to check the old council records for suspicious rulemaking. He arranged for the Redwood County administrative staff to gather the relevant documents. The archivists uncovered a trove of files detailing how, under Denise's tenure, the council's code had ballooned from a few pages to dozens, most rules added with minimal oversight. Interestingly, many targeted visible cultural expressions, from holiday decorations to music and gatherings. Each revision seemed aimed at stifling differences that Denise perceived as disruptions. While this investigation pressed forward, Martin received word that a sentencing date for Denise had been set. The Redwood County Courthouse braced for another media flurry. He suspected the judge, having witnessed the vitriol in the trial, would mete out a punishment that aimed to deter future abuses. The question was, would it be harsh enough to reflect the emotional toll she'd inflicted on so many? In the weeks leading up to sentencing, local journalists fixated on Denise's background. They discovered she came from a lineage of property developers who had historically shaped Bloomfield Grove's demographics, favoring certain prospective homeowners while discouraging or outright rejecting others. This historical pattern of unspoken redlining lent new gravity to her recent actions. For Martin, it cemented the idea that Denise's hostility wasn't random. It was the culmination of a worldview inherited from those who built the neighborhood in their image. Amid this swirl, Martin tried to be a reassuring presence in Bloomfield Grove. He walked the streets more often, greeting neighbors at their mailboxes, offering a calm ear to those uncertain about the council's future. One neighbor, a retired teacher named Carolyn Song, recounted how she'd felt pressured to remove wind chimes she'd bought on vacation in Thailand. Denise said they clashed with the community's aesthetic. Carolyn sighed. "I never realized it could be more than just taste. Maybe she was systematically wiping out personal expressions." This flood of stories weighed on Martin. He realized that while Denise bore direct responsibility for her actions, it was the entire environment of silent compliance that allowed her to thrive for so long. As sheriff, he resolved to promote not only legal justice but also dialogues about empathy and inclusion. Redwood County, with Bloomfield Grove as a microcosm, needed to confront how easily rules could morph into oppression when wielded by a single powerful voice. Finally, sentencing day arrived. The courtroom once again teemed with reporters, curious residents, and a subdued tension. Denise, escorted by deputies, appeared less defiant than before. Her attorney tried to paint her as remorseful, apologizing for any misinterpretations, and promising she'd learn to respect boundaries. But the prosecution emphasized the pattern of wrongdoing, from false police calls to instructions for fence demolition. They also read excerpts of her forum posts, highlighting bigoted undertones. When the judge delivered the sentence, community service, mandated anger management, a substantial fine, and removal from any council leadership roles, there was an audible hush. Some onlookers expected jail time, but the judge underscored that while the crimes were severe, the principal punishment here was to strip her of the power she had weaponized. Martin, seated among the crowd, felt a mix of relief and mild disappointment. He'd hoped for a stronger deterrent. Yet, the judge stressed that further civil rights charges might follow if investigators deemed her actions part of a broader discriminatory scheme. Outside, the press hammered Denise with questions, but deputies whisked her away, so no statement emerged. Martin, cornered by microphones, reiterated his stance: "I'm grateful for the court's decision. This isn't about punishing one person, it's about restoring fairness." The cameras captured every word, though Martin was careful not to appear celebratory. He was aware that many neighbors still faced the emotional fallout of her reign. In Bloomfield Grove, the news of Denise's forced departure from the Greenstone Council triggered a collective sigh of relief. People described feeling like a weight lifted, no longer fearful that a single phone call could subject them to fines or humiliating neighborly scrutiny. Freed from that grip, they approached Martin with tentative optimism, asking if Redwood County would support them in forming a more inclusive resident group. Martin encouraged them to stand up for a new, community advisory board that welcomed diverse ideas and set fair guidelines, free from the old hierarchy. Shortly thereafter, the existing council issued a public apology to the entire neighborhood, promising to revise its charter and implement anti-discrimination policies. They disavowed Denise's actions, though some observers wondered if they were simply trying to avoid deeper legal trouble. Meanwhile, Redwood County civil rights officials continued their inquiry, reminding the council that reforms would need genuine transparency and enforcement. For Martin, the experience left him more determined to champion justice, not only as a sheriff but as a neighbor. He realized how a single fixture of power, like a domineering HOA president, could stifle a whole community's spirit. By refusing to bow to intimidation, he and the other residents had dismantled that tyranny, paving the way for a kinder form of neighborhood unity. As Martin strolled down Bloomfield Grove's main street in the days after sentencing, he noticed subtle changes: neighbors planting flowers they'd once avoided for fear of code violation, a couple setting out multicultural decorations on their porch, children playing with chalk on driveways without fear of a complaint. He stopped to chat with them, praising their creative sidewalk art. He realized that while the fence fiasco had been the spark, the broader blaze was about inclusivity. Freed from stringent oversight, the suburb began revealing pockets of individuality once suppressed. Martin took pride in witnessing it. Redwood County, he hoped, would learn from Bloomfield Grove's cautionary tale. In a final conversation with a local news reporter, he stated, "Harmony is built on respect and equity, not rigid rules designed to exclude. I'm thankful we've begun forging a path forward." Thus, with Denise Caldwell's influence waning, Bloomfield Grove found itself at a crossroads, a chance to redefine what it meant to be a neighborhood, one that thrived on shared responsibility rather than fear. Martin Delgado, for his part, stood ready to support that transformation. He'd proven that the law, when wielded fairly, could check abuse of power. Now, the burden rested on everyone, residents, county officials, and newly energized community leaders, to keep the momentum toward genuine acceptance. In the wake of Denise Caldwell's sentencing, Bloomfield Grove braced for a period of transition. The Greenstone Council organized an emergency election to replace vacant seats, and the Redwood County Civil Rights Division intensified its oversight, ensuring the group's promises of reform were more than cosmetic. Meanwhile, Martin Delgado, Redwood County's steadfast sheriff, remained at the heart of these changes, both as the man who'd confronted Denise and as a neighbor determined to see genuine progress. Though the media storm died down, plenty of uneasy murmurs lingered. Some residents questioned if the council should be dissolved entirely, as a statement against the sort of tyranny Denise had enacted. Others hoped new leadership could redeem the institution. Public meetings drew unprecedented crowds, with neighbors voicing concerns over the council's old rules that once harbored prejudicial applications. The newly elected board members, a more diverse group, pledged transparency and formed committees to revise regulations. In short, Bloomfield Grove awakened to a civic energy missing for years. Amid these shifts, Martin often found himself approached by residents who'd previously kept a low profile under Denise's reign. One afternoon, a Kenyan-American couple, David and Wanjiru Kamau, invited him to see the backyard barbecue setup they'd never dared to install for fear of violating design codes. Martin assured them there was no legitimate code preventing them from enjoying their property. He felt a spark of joy witnessing them plan a robust summer gathering, free from intimidation. The neighborhood took on a new look, too. Houses that once matched each other like cookie-cutter cutouts began to reflect owners' personal touches, a bright orange door here, a whimsical garden gnome there. Freed from the possibility of petty fines, residents expressed themselves more vividly. Some gave Martin a nod of gratitude, insisting none of this freedom would be possible if he'd yielded to Denise's heavy-handed approach. Yet, not everyone embraced the wave of openness. A handful of old guard residents quietly griped about losing the neat aesthetic or letting the neighborhood slip. Martin observed them from a distance, suspecting they missed the old days when uniform exteriors masked deeper biases. Nonetheless, with Denise gone, their discontent rarely escalated beyond murmured complaints. The new council leadership also reassured them no one sought chaos, just a fair balance allowing personal expression. Meanwhile, Redwood County's Civil Rights Division advanced its own parallel case, investigating if the council's policies had systematically singled out minorities. They interviewed families who had faced suspicious code violations, cross-referenced times and dates with official council meeting notes, and delved into bank records that might reveal questionable fee allocations. Martin occasionally provided background on the scenario, though the division operated mostly independently. He was heartened to learn they uncovered evidence of internal watch lists for certain households, typically involving people of color or those with distinct cultural practices. If these documents held up in court, the council could face significant legal consequences, beyond individual fines or forced leadership changes. In the midst of these broader developments, Martin's day-to-day life regained a sense of normalcy. He replaced the sign reading "Under Investigation" near his fence with a small potted plant. The locksmith fiasco, once the spark that ignited everything, had become a memory overshadowed by the revelations about racism and power abuse. Yet, he still found times when he needed to remind himself, keep the cameras up, stay vigilant. After all, Denise's loyalists might attempt some petty retaliation, though they seemed rudderless without her leadership. One evening, Martin received an unexpected visitor. Rita Morales, the deputy who had initially responded to a few of Denise's false emergency calls. She came bearing a folder, explaining that Redwood County dispatch logs contained multiple suspicious call patterns from the months before Martin moved in. They suggested Denise, or someone connected to her, had dialed 911 for equally spurious reasons involving other families. Instances included claims of prowlers that turned out to be local teenagers, or noise complaints aimed at households hosting diverse cultural celebrations. The pattern was too consistent to be chance. As Martin reviewed the logs, gratitude welled up for how thoroughly Rita had scoured them. This was more proof of the biased harassment playing out under the veneer of official procedure. He realized that had he not confronted Denise's attempts on his own property, these older patterns might remain hidden. The logs would likely factor into the Civil Rights Division's case, bolstering the argument that something systematic and discriminatory was afoot. Outside Bloomfield Grove, Redwood County residents watched the saga with rapt interest. Martin received invites to speak at local gatherings about community fairness, a theme once overshadowed by typical small-town policing needs. Cautious of hogging the limelight, he tried to shift credit to the neighbors who bravely told their stories. Over cups of coffee in the newly restructured community center, folks swapped accounts of small injustices they'd endured, a penalty for planting sunflowers too tall, a forced repainting of a mural featuring African patterns. Martin quietly documented each anecdote, funneling them to the civil rights investigators. The day of the final council hearing arrived, a public forum where the new leadership would propose sweeping changes. A large crowd packed the same community center once used for private meetings led by Denise. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful. The new council president, a soft-spoken accountant named Clarissa Dorsey, revealed a revised charter. It drastically limited the council's power to levy fines or control aesthetic choices, instead focusing on basic neighborhood upkeep, roads, shared landscaping, safety checks. In a symbolic move, they abolished the old compliance committee that had given people like Denise a license to snoop on neighbors. They also instituted a community review board, ensuring any complaint was vetted by multiple voices. A wave of applause followed the announcement. Martin, standing near the back, felt a sense of relief. He recognized that no policy was perfect, but these reforms signaled a move away from the climate of fear that once prevailed. During the Q&A, some older residents grumbled about losing the uniform look of Bloomfield Grove. Clarissa handled their queries gently, emphasizing that uniformity should not override personal freedoms or be misused to discriminate. Martin admired her calm approach. She cited Redwood County's cultural tapestry, remarking that Bloomfield Grove could set a standard for respectful cohabitation. The crowd's mostly positive reaction suggested an appetite for renewal. By the forum's end, attendees mingled in conversation, forging new connections. Martin overheard neighbors discussing block parties, yard sales, and inclusive events that welcomed everyone. He felt a quiet pride, thinking that if not for his locked door fiasco, Bloomfield Grove might remain trapped under oppressive rules. His small step of rekeying locks had unearthed a far-reaching problem, one that was now being addressed openly. After the meeting, Clarissa approached Martin. "Thank you," she said simply. "Your courage helped us see what was wrong." He shook her hand, humility shining in his eyes. I only wanted a safe, respectful place to live. The real credit goes to those who stood up against the injustice quietly for years. They parted ways on an upbeat note. Two individuals from different backgrounds, united in forging a better environment. In the days that followed, Martin's house blossomed into a place of peace. Neighbors dropped by with garden produce or casual hellos. Manny the locksmith became a local anecdote, the honest tradesman who set all this in motion by changing a single door lock. Freed from the specter of an all-seeing council, children played in driveways, holiday decorations sprouted year-round, and even those nostalgic for uniform exteriors came to accept the new normal. Denise Caldwell, her sentencing behind her, served out her community service in a less prominent part of Redwood County. Rumors said she harbored bitterness but avoided public statements to avoid further legal trouble. Meanwhile, Redwood County's Civil Rights Division concluded that the council's old bylaws contained discriminatory mechanisms. They mandated further oversight and threatened to disband the organization if any whiff of prejudice re-emerged. For Martin, that was a suitable balance, major reform without crushing the communal spirit. Thus, Bloomfield Grove found itself in a moment of possibility. Freed from intimidation, shaped by an evolved council, the neighborhood had the chance to model how a diverse suburb could thrive. And Martin Delgado, once just a new sheriff with an unexpected neighbor crisis, remained a quiet guardian of this fragile progress, ensuring that any echoes of the past would be met with unwavering resolve. Months after Denise Caldwell's sentencing and the transformation within Bloomfield Grove, a reflective calm enveloped Martin Delgado. He'd settled into his life as Redwood County's sheriff with surprising ease, responding to typical calls, helping communities with minor spats or neighborhood watch programs, all the while carrying the memory of his confrontation with the Greenstone Council. Word of Bloomfield Grove's reforms spread quietly throughout Redwood County. Other neighborhoods, once wary of prying HOAs, looked to the new Greenstone Council charter for inspiration. Some small communities invited Martin to talk about balancing local guidelines with personal freedoms. He accepted a few engagements, more as a goodwill gesture than to garner any spotlight. He repeated a core message: good neighborhoods thrive on mutual respect, not rigid mandates or fear tactics. Despite the uneasy legacy of Denise's reign, daily life in Bloomfield Grove bloomed with renewed vitality. Children rode bikes freely, backyards hosted multicultural gatherings, and front gardens displayed an array of colors once banned by arbitrary rules. The sense of unity was gradual but palpable. Neighbors who'd rarely spoken now greeted each other warmly in the morning. Martin found a subtle comfort, seeing how adversity had prompted a shift toward genuine inclusivity. Every so often, he'd spot a faint shadow of the old days, a rumored complaint from a holdover who still pined for uniform lawns or disliked the disorder of personal expression. But the new council's leadership, under Clarissa Dorsey, typically handled these disputes with fairness, reminding folks that aesthetic preferences couldn't trump fundamental rights. The few who grumbled eventually adapted or chose to keep silent. Meanwhile, Redwood County's Civil Rights Division completed their inquiry, concluding that, while there had been patterns of targeted enforcement, the structural changes and the departure of individuals like Denise significantly reduced discriminatory practices. They encouraged the council to maintain diversity training for board members and to hold periodic public forums. Martin attended one such forum, content to see neighbors discussing issues civilly, rather than cowering before an autocrat. On a personal level, Martin's home life was blissfully unremarkable, exactly what he once dreamed of. The fence that caused so much turmoil remained standing, and Manny's lock still worked perfectly, never again questioned. Freed from tension, Martin found time to cultivate a small vegetable patch beside his yard. Sometimes, passers-by struck up friendly chats, offering gardening tips. It felt like the normal suburban experience he'd craved when he moved to Bloomfield Grove. One crisp autumn evening, Clarissa visited Martin bearing a homemade pie. They sat on his back porch, sampling the sweet pastry while she updated him on the council's progress. "We're rewriting sections of the old code," she explained. "So no future president can interpret them in a discriminatory way." Martin nodded with approval. She then expressed gratitude for his stand, remarking that had he caved in or resigned from the tension, Bloomfield Grove might still be shackled by old prejudices. Humbly, Martin insisted he'd only done what any law-abiding citizen should do. Still, Clarissa's praise warmed him. As the new council chair, she recognized that their community's transformation hinged on a rare synergy, Martin's willingness to call out wrongdoing, combined with the bravery of neighbors who'd come forward with past injustices. She left that evening, pie plate empty, but Martin felt his heart full, hopeful that each step forward meant fewer hidden bigotries taking root. In Redwood County's broader tapestry, Martin rose as a quietly admired figure. He implemented a few changes in the sheriff's office, promoting community outreach programs in underrepresented neighborhoods. While these initiatives never directly referred to Bloomfield Grove's saga, many recognized the impetus for bridging divides came from his personal ordeal. The city council, noticing the successful reforms, even considered a countywide advisory group to share best practices for HOAs, ensuring no second, Caldwell scenario, popped up. Though rumors sometimes swirled about Denise's post-sentencing bitterness, Martin rarely gave them thought. She had no official platform left, and Redwood County's watchful eyes likely prevented her from orchestrating a comeback. The overshadowing threat vanished, leaving Martin free to relish the peace. He found comfort in small-town policing, forging genuine bonds with folks who once considered him a distant figure. Every so often, he'd drive by the house where Denise once lived, now owned by a family who waved cheerfully. Bloomfield Grove's aesthetic had subtly changed, a mosaic of house colors, creative lawn ornaments, and lively cultural traditions, once taboo, now openly celebrated. Some might call it chaotic compared to the past, Martin would call it vibrant, a reflection of real people rather than the forced symmetry of a single vision. On a quiet Sunday morning, Martin sipped coffee on his porch, recalling the months of struggle, false alarms, property lines, forum posts with hateful undertones. He marveled at how a simple impetus, replacing locks, had unraveled a chain of deeper ills, culminating in a community's renewal. In his heart, he knew Redwood County would forever remain on guard against similar abuses, but for now, the tide had turned. And so life moved on. Martin Delgado's role as Redwood County's sheriff continued, but the episodes that once defined his welcome to Bloomfield Grove finally receded into stories neighbors told to newcomers. Tales of how a determined official confronted a misguided HOA leader circulated in hushed tones, culminating in an uplifting moral: no one, not even the most entrenched figure, could override basic respect and lawful decency. In that sense, Bloomfield Grove's saga ended not with a bang but with a collective sigh of relief, replaced by the murmur of a neighborhood forging a more inclusive identity. And Martin, content with the calm he'd earned, carried forward, ever vigilant, ever dedicated, but now wholeheartedly at home in a place that once tried so hard to keep him out. A year after Denise Caldwell vanished from Bloomfield Grove's daily life, the neighborhood radiated a comforting normalcy. Martin Delgado, Redwood County's sheriff and once her prime target, found himself reflecting on how far they'd come each time he walked through the quiet, tree-lined streets. The sense of tension once lurking behind every hedge had faded into a memory, one that taught valuable lessons on power, prejudice, and collective resilience. In the intervening months, many of the Greenstone Council's archaic rules were either repealed or overhauled. Residents discovered a deeper sense of camaraderie, forging new traditions, weekend potlucks celebrating various cultures, rummage sales supporting local charities, and open invitations for barbecues that welcomed newcomers. Where once conformity was enforced under Denise's iron hand, a thriving tapestry of individuality now bloomed. Martin, now a familiar face across Redwood County, balanced standard law enforcement duties, traffic stops, petty theft investigations, routine patrols, with continued community engagement. He became a regular speaker at local civic clubs, calmly recounting the Bloomfield Grove ordeal as a cautionary tale. "We can't let any single voice, however loud, stifle what makes our neighborhoods unique," he'd say. "We have to protect one another's rights, even in the simplest matters, like changing a lock or painting a door." Occasionally, curiosity flared about Denise's fate. After her sentencing, she served community service hours and attended mandatory anger management sessions. A few tabloids claimed she moved to a distant county, rumored to be making quiet attempts at re-entering some form of leadership role. Yet Redwood County's official stance remained clear: her conduct would not be tolerated if she attempted to rejoin local governance. With time, Redwood County's Civil Rights Division finished its thorough investigation into the council's discriminatory practices. Their final report praised the new, more diverse board for cooperating with reforms. While certain aspects of the old administration's wrongdoing were deemed beyond the statute of limitations, the council's apology and corrective measures stood as a testament to the neighborhood's commitment to forging a fair path forward. Among Bloomfield Grove's residents, stories of the locksmith affair, as they called it, became folklore. Manny the locksmith, in particular, became something of a local hero, receiving holiday cards from families who said his innocuous job triggered a chain reaction of positive change. Manny would laugh it off, insisting all credit went to Martin's perseverance. Still, neighbors insisted Manny was proof that even everyday tasks, like installing new locks, could unearth greater truths. As for Martin, he quietly carried the experience as a badge of responsibility. Bloomfield Grove represented both the joys and challenges of suburban life. Under the veneer of meticulously curated lawns, real struggles for acceptance could still lurk. In his position as sheriff, Martin pledged to remain vigilant, ensuring no one used bureaucratic power to oppress. He sometimes joked that while he'd expected Redwood County to be peaceful, the biggest drama he faced was right on his doorstep, revealing that small towns could hide big controversies. On a breezy Sunday, Martin hosted a block party in his yard, an event open to the entire neighborhood. Tables laden with food lined his driveway, a live band played gentle tunes, and kids ran around with laughter in the air. The new council members mingled freely, sharing updates on upcoming community projects without any gloom of intimidation. It felt like a triumphant display of what Bloomfield Grove had become: welcoming, vibrant, and unafraid of differences. Late in the evening, Martin relaxed on the porch swing, the last stragglers having bid goodnight. He reflected on how a year ago, the same space bore the weight of suspicion and tension. Now, it felt alive with the remnants of conversation and celebration. If Denise's era had taught him anything, it was that empathy and justice needed to go hand in hand. By refusing to bend to intimidation, he had allowed truth to come to light, galvanizing a community that once turned a blind eye. As moonlight illuminated the yard, Martin Delgado felt a peace that eluded him in those tumultuous early days. Redwood County still had challenges, every community did, but the saga of an overreaching leader had led to deeper unity, reminding everyone that the rule of law, anchored in fairness, could uphold genuine harmony. With that understanding, Martin could finally revel in the quiet confidence that his new home, and the county he served, were stepping forward on a path of mutual respect and open hearts. Hey everyone! If you found this story powerful and meaningful, please show your support by hitting the like button, subscribing to the channel, ringing the bell to never miss our thought-provoking content. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that inspire, educate, and challenge perspectives. Thank you for being part of this journey.